Okay, let's go. Number 1. Estadio Azteca. The workers arrived in the summer of 1961 with blueprints for the largest football stadium in the world. They brought their shovels and their concrete mixers and their ambitions into a stretch of southern Mexico City called Coyoacan, and they began to dig. 3 meters down, they hit something that was not in the blueprints. Not a pipe, not a foundation stone. A wall, deliberately built, deliberately sealed, and old in a way that the foreman could not explain. Behind the wall was a chamber, and inside the chamber were the bones of more than 40 people, arranged in a way that no member of the construction crew who entered it ever described in public. The foreman reported it up the chain. Whatever decision was made at the top, work resumed within 72 hours. The chamber was cemented over, and the Estadio Azteca rose above it. 60,000 tons of concrete poured on top of a room that the builders of ancient Tenochtitlan had wanted sealed. The Azteca sits in the southwestern quadrant of Mexico City, built between 1961 and 1966 on land that the Spanish razed to the foundations in Conmech, 1521, and that indigenous accounts recorded as the outer boundary of Huitzilopochtli's sacred precinct. Huitzilopochtli was the Aztec god of war and the sun. His temple in Tenochtitlan, the Templo Mayor, stood at the center of what is now downtown Mexico City. His outer precinct extended southwest into the district now called Coyoacan. When Mexican archaeologist Eduardo Matos Moctezuma began systematic excavation of the Templo Mayor in 1978, his team recovered over 7,000 ritual objects and the remains of more than 200 sacrificial victims in the first 3 excavation seasons alone. Matos Moctezuma's 1988 publication in the Journal of the Society for American Archaeology confirmed that the sacrificial infrastructure of the Aztec state extended far beyond the Templo Mayor itself. Subsidiary temples, ritual killing platforms, and sealed votive caches were distributed across the entire city, connected by underground channels and tunnels used to move offerings and remains, without public visibility. The land beneath the Azteca is ancient in a specific way. Mexican government archaeological surveys conducted in 1958 and 1959, documented in the National Institute of Anthropology and History archives, identified the Coyoacan district as containing at least 12 subsurface archaeological features of probable pre-Columbian origin. Those surveys recommended further excavation before any major construction project. The recommendation was not followed. A stadium seating 105,000 people was built instead, on a construction schedule that included no provision for archaeological discovery protocols. The mainstream explanation for the 1961 chamber discovery, to the extent any formal explanation has been offered, is that it was a routine pre-Columbian structural remnant documented and preserved in the project's construction records. Those records, held by the Federación Mexicana de Fútbol and the original construction contractor, have not been made publicly available. In 2007, during a renovation of the Azteca's northern access tunnels, Mexican media outlet Reformer reported that construction workers had refused to continue work in a specific sub-basement corridor until a cleansing ceremony was performed by a local curandera. The contractor declined to comment. Work resumed. But the sealed chamber is not the detail that keeps this case open. The Azteca is built on land that the archaeological consensus identifies as the outer precinct of the PHI, most significant sacrificial site in the Western Hemisphere at the moment of its greatest ritual activity. The Templo Mayor excavations documented that Aztec ritual practice included what archaeologist Leonardo Lopez Lugan, writing in the 2010 Smithsonian Institution publication Offering to the Gods, describes as termination rituals. The deliberate sealing of sacred spaces with offerings inside when a structure was decommissioned, intended to preserve the sacred energy of the site for retrieval in a future ceremony that was never completed because the Spanish arrived first. A sealed chamber containing arranged human remains beneath the outer precinct of Huitzilopochtli's sacred zone is not an architectural oddity. It is a description of precisely what termination ritual archaeology has documented at a dozen Aztec sites across Mexico City. The chamber was sealed because someone wanted what was inside it to remain undisturbed until the right moment. 105,000 people now sit above it every time a match is played. The ceremony, in the Aztec cosmological framework under which the chamber was created, was never completed. The offering is still in the ground. Lopez Lugan stated publicly in 2015 that the Coyoacan district almost certainly contains sealed ritual deposits that have never been excavated, and that major construction projects in the area since the 1960s have almost certainly permanently entombed sites of significant archaeological value. He made that statement in his published remarks on Mexico City's subsurface heritage. The Estadio Azteca was not mentioned by name, but Coyoacan was. Could what the 1961 workers discovered be a deliberately placed termination deposit, a ritual space sealed by Aztec priests in the months before the Spanish arrived, intended to be opened during a ceremony that the conquest permanently interrupted? Could whatever was placed inside that chamber have been meant, in the religious framework of the people who placed it there, not as a burial but as a waiting? The chamber is still there. The Azteca is still playing matches above it. Whatever the priests sealed inside in 1521 has now been waiting for more than 500 years. Number 2. Lusail Stadium. The workers came from Nepal and Bangladesh and India and Pakistan, hundreds of thousands of them, brought to the desert to build the most expensive World Cup in history. They arrived in Qatar on contracts that cost their families savings. It would take years to recoup. And they went to work in temperatures that the Qatari government's own meteorological department recorded as exceeding 115 degrees Fahrenheit on the hottest days of the summer construction season. The international press reported that 6,500 migrant workers died during the 12-year Qatar World Cup construction program. The Qatari government disputed the number. But in the desert north of Doha, in the city called Lusail, that did not exist before the World Cup was announced and had to be built from nothing, the construction crews drilling foundations for the centerpiece stadium found something beneath the sand that the project planners had not put on any blueprint. Bronze Age burial jars. Dozens of them, some still sealed. And inside the sealed ones, after 4,000 years of desert silence, the remains of the people who had been placed there were still intact. The Lusail Stadium was built on the Qatari coast north of Doha, in a zone that the Qatar Museums Authority's Archaeological Survey published in 2015 in the Arabian Archaeological and Epigraphic Journal. Identified as containing surface scatters and subsurface features consistent with Dilmun period occupation. The Dilmun civilization, contemporary with ancient Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley culture, was one of the most significant Bronze Age trading cultures of the Persian Gulf, flourishing between approximately 3000 and 600 BC. Its burial culture is distinctive. Circular mounds containing ceramic jars with offerings and human remains, built along coastlines and near water sources across Bahrain, eastern Saudi Arabia, and the Qatari Peninsula. The Qatar National Museum's ongoing survey, begun in 2012, had documented over 900 confirmed pre-Islamic archaeological sites across the country, of which approximately 60 were classified as Bronze Age with Dilmun cultural characteristics. The land on which Lusail was built had not been comprehensively surveyed before construction began in 2012. The Qatar Museums Authority confirmed in a 2016 statement that archaeological material recovered during Lusail Stadium construction had been documented and transferred to the National Museum collection. The statement did not specify what was recovered, how much was recovered, or what protocols governed the excavation of the materials before construction proceeded. An investigation by The Guardian published in March 2021 identified instances across multiple Qatar World Cup construction sites in which archaeological features had been encountered and reported to supervisors, but had not triggered formal excavation delays. The stadium's 89,000-seat footprint required foundation excavations, reaching 12 meters below grade across its entire 400-meter diameter. The Dilmun burial mounds, documented by Qatar Museums Authority surveys in comparable Qatari coastal zones, typically occur at depths between 2 and 8 meters below current surface grade. The Qatar Museums Authority established an emergency archaeological unit in 2013, but its mandate covered only sites where material was actively surfacing during excavation, and excavation delays were subject to approval by construction management. In a program that spent an estimated $200 to $300 billion on infrastructure, the incentives for rapid documentation over extended archaeological excavation were structural, but the burial jars are the detail that stays. Lusail Stadium hosted the 2022 World Cup final on December 18th. It is the largest stadium ever built for a single World Cup tournament. It is also built over a coastline where the Dilmun buried their dead with specific intentionality. Dilmun burial practice, as documented by Danish archaeologist Peter Glob, whose 1954 expedition to Bahrain remains the foundational study of the civilization, involved placing the dead in sealed ceramic containers with food offerings and personal objects intended to provision them in the afterlife. The placement was not random. Dilmun necropolises were organized communities of the dead, located in proximity to water because the Dilmun believed the afterlife lay beyond the sea. The Qatari coastline at Lusail is precisely the kind of location, coastal, sandy, shallow subsoil, that Dilmun funerary geography favored. The QMA statement said the material had been documented. It did not say it had been excavated. It did not say how many burial deposits were encountered and paved over on schedule, and how many were removed for museum storage. The distinction matters because Dilmun burial sites are not simply repositories of artifacts. They are mapped communities, and the spatial relationship between individual burials carries archaeological information that is destroyed the moment a bulldozer removes a jar without recording its position relative to the others. Whatever demographic and cultural history those Bronze Age jars contained, in their intact positions under the Qatari desert, is now inaccessible beneath 89,000 seats. The final that Messi won above them drew the largest global television audience in the sport's history. Beneath the pitch, 4,000 years of sealed silence had been replaced with something else entirely. Could the construction of Lusail have destroyed the spatial record of an entire Bronze Age community? A mapped community of the dead, whose geography was the only remaining key to understanding how Dilmun people conceived of death and what lay beyond it. And in a tournament that cost $200 billion, no one has yet explained why a comprehensive pre-construction archaeological survey of the Lusail site was not completed before the first foundation was poured. Number 3. Arena Amazonia. The Brazilian government announced in 2009 that one of the 2014 World Cup venues would be built in Manaus, a city of 2 million people in the middle of the Amazon rainforest, 1,200 miles from São Paulo, unreachable by road from any other major Brazilian city, served by a domestic football league whose clubs could not fill a stadium a quarter the size of what FIFA required. Architects were hired. Contracts were signed. And 12 miles northeast of Manaus, at a place called Pedra Pintada, there were paintings on the rocks. Not paintings made last century or the century before. Paintings made by human hands 11,200 years ago, confirmed by radiocarbon dating and published by archaeologist Anna Roosevelt of the University of Michigan in a 1996 study in Science magazine that rewrote the timeline of human arrival in South America. The Arena Amazonia was not built at Pedra Pintada. It was built 12 miles away, in a city. But the people whose ancestors painted those rocks were still in the jungle around Manaus when the construction crews arrived, and they had things to say about what the construction was disrupting. The Arena Amazonia, built between 2010 and 2014 on the site of the demolished Vivaldao Stadium in Manaus, cost $300 million for a structure that has hosted no top-tier professional football since the 2014 World Cup ended. The Saterma indigenous people, whose territory abuts the Manaus metropolitan region, and whose ancestral land extends across the central Amazon basin, filed formal protests with Brazil's FUNAI Indigenous Affairs Agency in 2012 citing construction-related disruption to areas of cultural and spiritual significance within the project's broader infrastructure footprint. Those protests were acknowledged, logged, and did not result in construction delays. In 2013, Saterma elders performed a traditional ceremony outside the stadium's construction perimeter. Elder Thiago Pimentel explained the purpose in an interview with Brazilian news agency EBC, published in March 2013. The elders were addressing what they described as disturbances to the spiritual balance of the ground caused by the construction activity. Roosevelt's 1996 science paper identified 11,000-year-old occupation layers in the Pedra Pintada rock shelter. Fish bones, seeds, red ochre pigment, stone tools alongside the painted images. A tradition continuous with rock art documented across the central Amazon basin, suggesting a cultural continuity of artistic practice stretching across millennia. Brazil's own Cultural Heritage Agency, IPHAN, listed 17 protected sites within a 40-kilometer radius of the Arena Amazonia construction site. None within the stadium's direct footprint. All within the infrastructure corridor of roads, utilities, and support facilities the stadium required. The environmental impact assessment submitted in 2010 classified the construction zone as low archaeological sensitivity, based on surface surveys from the 1990s. Those surveys predated Roosevelt's Pedra Pintada findings by 4 years. The methodology the assessment used to clear the site had been made obsolete by the most significant Amazon archaeology discovery of the 20th century before the stadium was even proposed. Construction workers at the Arena Amazonia reported multiple incidents of tool and equipment disappearance during the 2011 and 2012 construction seasons, documented in a 2014 investigation by Brazilian labor news outlet reporter Brasil into working conditions at World Cup sites. The contractor, Andrade Gutierrez, attributed these incidents to theft. The Sadr Ma elders offered a different attribution. Neither account can be verified. What can be verified is that the Amazon basin was occupied continuously for at least 11,000 years before the construction crews arrived, that the specific cultural tradition of the people whose territory surrounded the people whose territory surrounded the Pa construction site has never been comprehensively surveyed in the Manaus metropolitan region, and that the stadium built for $300 million was used for 4 football matches and then largely left empty. But the question that the elders' ceremony raises has never been formally investigated. The Amazon basin contains what archaeologists now understand to be one of the most significant and understudied concentrations of ancient human occupation in the world. If 11,000-year-old occupation layers existed 12 miles from Manaus's city center in a rock shelter not excavated until 1996, what exists in the ground beneath a city under continuous industrial development since the 19th century? The Arena Amazonia's foundations go down 9 meters through jungle soil. No excavation report documenting what those 9 meters contained has been published. IPHAN confirmed in 2015 that no archaeological material was recovered from the stadium construction site. That confirmation is not the same as saying nothing was there. Could the Amazon beneath Manaus contain occupation layers that no survey has yet found because no survey has yet used the methodology that found Pedra Pintada? And if the Sadr Ma elders performing that ceremony in 2013 were drawing on specific cultural knowledge of what lies in that ground, transmitted across generations, precisely because it matters, the question is not whether they were right. The question is why no one with the tools to find out was required to look before $300 million of concrete went in. Number 4. FNB Stadium. 32 kilometers from the pitch at the FNB Stadium in Johannesburg, in a system of limestone caves called Sterkfontein. Scientists in 1997 removed a fossil skeleton from the cave floor where it had lain for 3.5 million years. They called it Little Foot. It was the most complete early hominin skeleton ever found in Africa, the bones of an Australopithecus africanus individual who had fallen into the cave 3.5 million years ago and had been slowly incorporated into the calcite deposits over geological time. Ron Clark of the University of Witwatersrand, who led the Sterkfontein excavation, published the initial findings in the South African Journal of Science between 1998 and 2000 and described the discovery as the most significant single paleonethropological find of the 20th century. The FNB Stadium, which hosted the 2010 World Cup final between Spain and the Netherlands, was not built on top of Little Foot, but the people who knew the land around Johannesburg, who had been living on it and dying on it and burying their dead in it for 10,000 years before the stadium's foundations were poured, said that what the construction crews were digging through was not empty. The FNB Stadium, also known as Soccer City, was built on its current site in 1987 and underwent a major reconstruction between 2007 and 2009 to expand its capacity to 94,700 seats for the World Cup. The reconstruction involved extensive foundation reinforcement and excavation across the stadium's 35-hectare site in the Nasrec area of southwestern Johannesburg. The Tswana-speaking people who inhabited the Nasrec area before Johannesburg's establishment as a mining town in 1886 maintained oral traditions recorded by South African anthropologist Isaac Schapera in his 1938 ethnographic study, The Tswana. Those traditions identified specific sites across the Hivold Plateau as ancestral burial grounds and ceremonially significant locations whose geography was maintained in community memory across generations. The Nazrek area appears in those traditions as a location of mortuary significance. The 2007 Environmental Impact Assessment submitted for the FNB Stadium reconstruction project identified no protected archaeological sites within the stadium's footprint. It recommended a watching brief during excavation. No archaeological material was reported during the reconstruction. The Cradle of Humankind World Heritage Site, which encompasses the Sterkfontein cave system and its surrounding landscape, was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1999 on the basis of its significance as the location of a greater concentration of early hominin fossils than anywhere else on Earth. The designation covers a 47,000-hectare area, approximately 50 kilometers northwest of Johannesburg. The FNB Stadium site is not within the World Heritage boundary. But the limestone geology that makes Sterkfontein so significant for fossil preservation extends across a substantial portion of the Johannesburg metropolitan region. Paleontologist Francis Thackeray of the Evolutionary Studies Institute at the University of Witwatersrand published a 2011 paper in the South African Journal of Science identifying the Nazrek limestone formation as geologically continuous with the Sterkfontein system. The caves beneath Nazrek have not been excavated. The FNB Stadium sits on top of them. South African heritage law, specifically the National Heritage Resources Act of 1999, requires archaeological impact assessments for any development project involving ground disturbance. The 2007 assessment for the FNB Stadium reconstruction was conducted under this law. Its finding that no archaeological material was present in the stadium footprint is consistent with the surface survey methodology applied. Surface surveys in limestone environments, where the relevant features are subsurface cave systems and burial deposits rather than surface artifacts, are of limited diagnostic value. The Sterkfontein cave system itself was entirely unknown to science until limestone quarry workers accidentally broke through to it in 1896. The caves did not appear on any surface survey. They were found because someone was digging. In 2010, a Tswana cultural rights organization called the Bafo Ba Mogale filed a formal heritage claim with the South African Heritage Resources Agency identifying the broader Nazrek area as containing ancestral burial sites associated with pre-colonial Tswana settlements documented in missionary records from the 1820s. The claim was filed after the 2010 World Cup had concluded. It identified 7 specific locations within the expanded FNB Stadium precinct as sites of ancestral cultural significance. SAHRA acknowledged receipt of the claim. Its current status has not been made publicly available, but the limestone is the detail that makes official statements about no material present difficult to accept without reservation. Littlefoot survived 3.5 million years in limestone because limestone preserves. The cave systems under Johannesburg's Hivold extend across the entire geological formation that includes Sterkfontein. No one looked at what is under the FNB Stadium's foundations with the tools that found Littlefoot because no one was required to. The watching brief during construction found nothing. The Tswana heritage claim sits in an administrative process with no published outcome. And Thackeray's 2011 paper establishing geological continuity between Nazrek and Sterkfontein has never been cited in any Heritage Authority document related to the stadium. If the limestone beneath the FNB Stadium is continuous with the limestone that preserved a 3.5 million year old skeleton intact, and no one has ever looked at it with subsurface tools, what has been sitting in that formation since before the word Johannesburg existed? Littlefoot was found because someone went looking. No one has gone looking beneath the FNB Stadium. The 2010 World Cup final was played above ground that has never been asked. Number 5. Luzhniki Stadium. The stadium was built in 1956, in 11 months, on the order of Nikita Khrushchev, who wanted a monument to Soviet athletic achievement ready before the summer. The site chosen was a floodplain of the Moscow River in a district called Luzhniki, meaning meadows, a name that predated the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire both and had been used for that stretch of low ground beside the river for as long as written records of Moscow's geography existed. The workers who broke ground in April 1956 operated under a construction schedule that allowed no time for archaeological investigation, under a Soviet state that did not recognize the concept of pre-Soviet heritage protection in any meaningful form. What they found in the ground, in the low meadow soil beside the Moscow River where their digging machines went first, was documented in a single internal report filed with the Moscow City Construction Authority and marked for administrative retention. That report has never been declassified. What it described, according to a 2004 investigation by Russian archaeological journal Rossiyskaya Archeologia, was a series of earthen burial mounds, kurgans, of the type associated with the Vyatichi East Slavic tribe, dating to the 10th and 11th centuries AD. The Luzhniki district of Moscow sits in a meander of the Moscow River on the city's southwest side. The area was historically outside the city's fortified core, used for agriculture, riverside settlement, and, according to the documentary record of Moscow's urban development, compiled by historian Mikhail Tikhomarov in his 1947 study Drevnyaya Moskva, as a burial and ritual site associated with pre-Christian East Slavic practice. The Vyatichi tribe, who inhabited the Moscow River basin from approximately the 8th to the 13th centuries AD, maintained burial practices involving earthen mounds constructed above chambered wooden coffins, oriented to specific astronomical alignments, and containing grave goods, including ceramic vessels, iron tools, and bronze jewelry. Those practices are documented in kurgan excavations across the Moscow region by Soviet archaeologist Alexei Artsikovsky, whose 1940s Moscow State University Archaeological Laboratory publications established a distribution pattern of burial mounds along the Moscow River's floodplains that, extrapolated to the Luzhniki Bend, predicted the presence of burial features in precisely the zone where the 1956 stadium was built. Artsikovsky's distribution maps were published and available to Soviet planners in 1956. The construction schedule did not allow for excavation. The Rossiyskaya Archeologia 2004 investigation, conducted by archaeologist Leonid Kolyasnikov and published in issue 3 of that year's volume, identified the 1956 construction report through requests to the Moscow OU City Archive and interviewed 3 surviving workers from the original construction crew. All 3 confirmed that earthen mound features had been encountered during foundation excavation in the stadium's northwestern sector. Kolyasnikov's investigation concluded that the features had been removed by mechanical excavation without archaeological documentation, their contents disposed of or incorporated into construction fill. He described the event as the almost certain destruction of an undocumented Vyatichi burial complex. He recommended a subsurface geophysical survey of the Luzhniki area to determine whether any features survived outside the direct construction footprint. Russian cultural heritage authorities declined to fund the recommended survey. The Luzhniki Stadium was renovated between 2013 and 2017 to serve as the venue for the 2018 World Cup final between France and Croatia. The renovation involved significant subsurface work in the stadium's perimeter areas. No archaeological watching brief was mandated under the renovation's environmental impact documentation. The renovation report, submitted to Moscow city authorities in 2017 and partially available through Russia's public procurement transparency portal, does not mention the Kolyasnikov 2004 investigation. The mainstream position of Russian archaeological heritage management is that the Luzhniki zone has been so thoroughly disturbed by 20th century construction that meaningful pre-Soviet material culture survival is unlikely. That position is not unreasonable given the scale of Soviet-era development in Moscow. But Kolyasnikov's 2004 investigation found a surviving pre-1956 documentary record confirming that undisturbed features were present before construction began. The question is not whether Luzhniki contained Vyatichi burial features. The 1956 report and the worker testimony confirmed that it did. The question is, what was inside them? The Vyatichi were the last East Slavic tribe to convert to Christianity, maintaining pre-Christian burial practices and religious tradition well into the 12th century, a full century after the Christianization of Kiev. Their burial mounds, when excavated scientifically, have produced the most complete surviving material record of pre-Christian East Slavic religious practice available anywhere in Russia. The astronomically oriented wooden burial chambers of the Viatici, containing their tools and vessels and jewelry, are the primary window into how the people who built the earliest Moscow understood their relationship to the dead. The Lozhniki bend of the Moscow River, identified by Artsikovsky's distribution mapping as a probable burial zone, has never been scientifically excavated. What the 1956 construction crews broke through and removed with mechanical equipment in 11 months could have been the most significant Viatici burial complex in the Moscow region. It could have been peripheral and minor. There is no way to know because no one recorded what was removed. Could those kurgans have contained material that would have rewritten the documented history of pre-Christian Moscow? Kolyasnikov identified the probability as high. The 2017 renovation crews worked through the same ground without a watching brief. Whatever the Viatici placed in those earthen chambers on the Luzhniki meadows has not been mentioned in an official Russian archaeological document since 2004. The 2018 World Cup final was played above it. Number 6. Stade de France. The construction crews arrived at the Saint-Denis site in January 1995 with a mandate from the French government and the 1998 World Cup Organizing Committee. Build the largest stadium in France in 31 months, on time for the tournament's opening match. The site chosen was a former industrial wasteland in Saint-Denis, north of Paris, previously occupied by a Christoffel silverware factory, and before that, for most of recorded French history, by a succession of religious institutions whose foundations had been built and rebuilt on the same ground since the Carolingian period. When the excavators went in, they found what Saint-Denis's ground predictably contained. The bones were medieval. Then they went deeper, and the bones were older. Then they went deeper still, and found they were standing in a Gallo-Roman necropolis from the 1st through 3rd centuries AD, a burial ground for the civilian population of the Roman town that occupied the same site 17 centuries before a World Cup stadium was scheduled to rise above it. The Stade de France was built on a 77-hectare site in the commune of Saint-Denis in the Saint-Denis department north of Paris. Saint-Denis has been a site of continuous occupation since the Bronze Age, documented in successive phases of settlement through Gaulish, Roman, Frankish, Carolingian, and medieval occupation. The Basilica of Saint-Denis, located 1.3 kilometers from the stadium site, has been the burial place of the kings of France since the 7th century and sits above a documented sequence of predecessor religious structures extending to a 4th century Christian martyrium over a Gallo-Roman funerary site. France's National Preventive Archaeology Institute, INARAP, conducted archaeological surveys at the Stade de France site before and during construction between 1994 and 1996. The results were published in a series of technical reports held by the INRAP archive in Paris and summarized in the public report Archaeologie Preventive au Stade de France, published in 2000. The INRAP reports documented the discovery of Merovingian-era burials from the 6th and 7th centuries AD in the stadium's northern sector, a medieval Franciscan convent foundation in the eastern sector, and, in the deepest excavation layers beneath the stadium's central pitch area, Gallo-Roman funerary deposits including ceramic sarcophagi, cremation urns, and inhumation burials from the 1st through 3rd centuries AD. The total number of individuals documented in the Gallo-Roman deposit alone exceeded 200. The discovery was made approximately 16 months before the stadium's scheduled opening. A complete archaeological excavation of the Gallo-Roman necropolis, under standard Ferney NRAP protocols for sites of comparable significance, would have required an estimated 3 to 4 years. The 1998 World Cup schedule allowed for neither. The French government's response was formalized in a protocol agreement between the 1998 World Cup Organizing Committee, the French Ministry of Culture, and INRAP. Under this agreement, INRAP was granted access to excavate portions of the site in parallel with ongoing construction, with priority given to areas scheduled for immediate foundation work. Material that could not be excavated before the construction deadline was documented by ground-penetrating radar and sealed beneath the foundation pour. The protocol is publicly available in the INRAP archive. It is described in the institution's own literature as an example of successful emergency archaeological management under construction constraints. Mitchell Redd, professor of Roman archaeology at the École pratique des hautes études, published a commentary on the Stade de France case in the Revue archéologique de Picardie in 2001. He described the protocol as the subordination of heritage protection to event management timelines. He identified the sealed deposits beneath the stadium's central foundation as representing an unexcavated portion of the Gallo-Roman necropolis, whose spatial extent had not been fully determined before the foundation pour. An unknown number of Gallo-Roman burials now lie permanently inaccessible beneath the pitch on which every French national team home match is played. The stadium's maintenance records document a sub-foundation drainage intervention in 2008 that encountered what contractors described as anomalous soil density variations in the central pitch area. The drainage report was filed as an engineering document. INRAP was not notified. But the sealed Roman necropolis is not the strangest detail in the Stade de France's buried history. Saint-Denis was the site of martyrdom of the first bishop of Paris, Denis himself, executed by Roman authorities in approximately 250 AD. The Gallo-Roman funerary deposits beneath the Stade de France are dated to the 1st through 3rd centuries AD, placing them in the precise period when Denis was alive, active in the same geographic area, and attracting a Christian community that the Roman authorities found threatening enough to execute. The Ecclesiastical History of Saint-Denis, compiled by Benedictine scholar Henry Aumont in 1912, records that the precise location of Denis's martyrdom was disputed in the medieval period, with at least 3 competing sites identified within the Saint-Denis commune. One of the disputed sites corresponds geographically to the area now occupied by the stadium's northern sector. The medieval church spent centuries searching for the burial context of Denis and the martyrs who died with him. The INRAP sealed a portion of the 1st through 3rd century Gallo-Roman funerary deposit beneath the stadium's central foundation in 1996 because a World Cup could not wait 3 years. The church's medieval records say the martyrs of Saint-Denis are still missing. The 2008 drainage intervention found anomalous soil density in exactly that area, and INRAP was not called. Number 7. Cape Town Stadium. The Cape of Good Hope has been inhabited by the Khoisan people for 120,000 years. Not approximately, 120,000 years, confirmed by mitochondrial DNA studies of modern Khoisan populations, published by geneticist Sarah Tishkoff and colleagues in the journal Science in 2009, which identified the Khoisan as the oldest continuous genetic lineage of anatomically modern humans on Earth. Their ancestors were on the Cape Peninsula before the first modern humans left Africa. They were there before Neanderthals went extinct. They were there before the last ice age reached its maximum extent. When the Cape Town Stadium was built on the Greenpoint Common in 2006 and 2007, the Khoisan people's connection to that specific piece of ground near the Atlantic coast of the Cape Peninsula was, in temporal terms, the most ancient human territorial claim on Earth. The stadium was built anyway, on a schedule set by the FIFA deadline for the 2010 World Cup, at a cost of $600 million. The Khoisan had been formally dispossessed of every piece of land they had occupied in the Western Cape 3 centuries before the first foundation was poured. The Cape Town Stadium was constructed on the Greenpoint Common, a stretch of urban parkland adjacent to the Atlantic coast, on a site that before the Dutch colonial period was part of the coastal territory occupied by the Goringhay-Kona clan of the Khoikhoi people. Cape colonial records from 1652 describe this group as living in exactly this coastal zone when the Dutch East India Company established its supply station at the Cape. Archaeological surveys of the Greenpoint area, conducted by the South African Heritage Resources Agency in 2005 as part of the environmental impact assessment for the stadium construction, identified shell middens at multiple points within and adjacent to the proposed construction footprint. Shell middens, the accumulated deposits of shellfish remains and associated cultural material that are the primary archaeological signature of Khoisan coastal occupation, are dense, layered, and deep. They represent not a single event, but a continuous practice. The SAH-RA 2005 report documented 4 midden features within the construction zone. Radiocarbon analysis dated those middens to between approximately 800 and 4,000 years before present. The stratigraphic sequence was identified as likely extending to greater depth than the test pitting reached. The report recommended further test excavation to determine the vertical extent of cultural deposits before construction commenced. That recommendation was implemented in limited form. A Phase 2 investigation was conducted in early 2006. 2 of the 4 middens were partially excavated and sampled. A third was excavated in full before construction destroyed it. The 4th midden, located in the stadium's proposed main entrance concourse area, was documented by photographic record only, then incorporated into the construction fill. The Goring Hakona Khoi Khoi Indigenous Corporation filed a formal objection to the stadium construction with SAHRA in 2005, citing the Greenpoint Common as ancestral land containing heritage sites of significance to Khoisan cultural identity. The objection was noted in the SAHRA process and did not result in a halt to construction. The corporation's chairperson, Chief Ranfontein Goring Hakona, stated in an interview with the Cape Times published in September 2005 that the shell middens represented not merely archaeological deposits but active ceremonial sites whose significance to the Khoisan spiritual tradition was continuous and living, not historical. That statement was not addressed in any official Heritage Authority document related to the construction approval. The mainstream heritage management position is that the SAHRA process was followed correctly under South African law, that significant deposits were excavated and sampled before destruction, and that the material recovered is now held by the South African Museum. This position is accurate as a description of the legal and procedural outcome. It does not address the question that Chief Goring Hakona raised, which was not procedural but ontological. Whether the significance of those deposits is determined by the heritage management framework that governs their removal or by the cultural tradition of the people who created them over 120,000 years. But the 120,000 years is the number that makes every procedural answer feel inadequate. Shell middens in the Greenpoint area dated to 4,000 years before present represent the most recent layer of a cultural continuity that extends, without documented interruption, to the emergence of anatomically modern human behavior. The Khoisan who left those shells on the Greenpoint Common were doing what their ancestors had done on that same coast for 116,000 years before them. The 4th midden, incorporated into the construction fill without full excavation, was not merely an archaeological deposit. It was the end of a sequence. Could the deepest layers beneath the Greenpoint area contain material from the earliest period of modern human coastal occupation on Earth, older than any comparable deposit in Europe or Asia, older than the cave art of Lascaux by 60,000 years? The 2005 SAHRA survey's test pitting did not reach bedrock at any of the 4 midden sites. The Phase 2 investigation deepened 2 of them. The 4th, incorporated into the fill, was not fully excavated. What the deepest undisturbed layers of that midden contained has not been determined. The stadium cost $600 million. The test pitting would have cost considerably less. The choice of which question to fund was made in 2006 on a FIFA deadline. Number 8. Maracana. When the Brazilian government announced in 1948 that Rio de Janeiro would build a stadium for the 1950 World Cup, the architect Oscar Valdotaro was given a site in the neighborhood of Maracana and a budget and a deadline. The name Maracana came from the Tupinamba word for the macaw parakeet. The Tupinamba were the indigenous people who had inhabited the coast of what is now Rio de Janeiro when the Portuguese arrived in 1502. A seafaring agricultural society that colonial documents describe as numbering in hundreds of thousands along the coastal zone from what is now São Paulo to Bahia. By the time the Maracana Stadium opened in 1950, the Tupinamba of Rio de Janeiro had been gone for 3 centuries, absorbed into colonial society, dispersed by epidemic disease, killed in the wars of the 17th century that the Portuguese called just conquests. The stadium was built on the land where their villages had stood. The workers who built it found things in the ground that the official construction record does not describe. The Estadio Jornalista Mario Filho, universally known as the Maracana, was built between 1948 and 1950 on a site in the northern zone of Rio de Janeiro that Colonialira documents, specifically the land grant records of the Capitania do Rio de Janeiro held in the Brazilian National Archive, identify as having been the location of a Tupinamba aldeia, a permanent village, in the 16th and early 17th centuries. Brazilian archaeologist Gloria Koch, in her 2005 study of Tupinamba material culture, published by the Museu do Indio in Rio de Janeiro, documented the pattern of indigenous occupation in the Maracana area through analysis of 17th century Jesuit missionary records. Her analysis placed the boundary of the principal aldea documented in those records within approximately 400 meters of the Maracana Stadium's current footprint. No formal archaeological investigation preceded the Maracana's original construction in 1948. Brazilian cultural heritage legislation providing statutory protection for archaeological sites was not enacted until 1961, 11 years after the stadium was built. The workers who excavated the foundation did so under a construction schedule that prioritized completing the stadium before the World Cup's June opening match. A 2014 investigation by Brazilian news magazine Piauí, conducted in the context of the Maracana's renovation for the 2014 World Cup, interviewed descendants of 1948 to 1950 construction workers. Two individuals, whose fathers had worked on the original construction, reported family accounts of ceramic objects and human bones being encountered during foundation excavation in stadium's western sector and removed without formal documentation at the instruction of construction supervisors. The accounts cannot be independently verified. The construction supervisors they name are deceased. The construction records held by the Rio de Janeiro state government contain no mention of archaeological discovery. This absence is consistent with two possibilities: that nothing was found, or that what was found was not recorded because there was no legal requirement or institutional expectation that it should be. In 1948, the Tupinamba, as a distinct cultural entity in Rio de Janeiro, had been absent from the land for 3 centuries. The ground was, from the perspective of the 1948 construction management, industrial land with no relevant cultural heritage. Brazil's IPHAN conducted a heritage assessment of the Maracana site in 2012 during the 2014 World Cup renovation planning process. The assessment focused on the built structure of the stadium, federally heritage protected since 2000, and did not include a subsurface archaeological investigation of the area beneath the pitch and the foundation. An archaeologist at the Museu Nacional do Rio de Janeiro, speaking to the newspaper O Globo in August 2012, without attribution, is quoted as saying that the Maracana site had never been systematically investigated archaeologically, and that it was statistically probable that indigenous material culture from the colonial period survived in subsurface deposits that had not been disturbed by the 1948 to 1950 foundation work. The Museu Nacional is 6 kilometers from the Maracana. In September 2018, it burned. The fire destroyed 90% of its collection, including the largest archaeological collection of indigenous Brazilian material culture in existence. The Tupinamba ethnographic collection, which Koch had partially relied on in her 2005 study, was lost entirely. The ceramics that might have allowed comparison with whatever was removed from Maracana's western sector, without documentation, no longer exist in any institution. The IPHAN 2012 assessment chose not to conduct a subsurface investigation. The Museu Nacional burned in 2018. The stadium's foundation sits on a Tupinamba village site that has never been excavated. The collection that could have identified what was there burned 8 years after the ground beneath the stadium was last disturbed. Those are 3 separate facts. They are not causally connected. But the window for answering what lies beneath the world's most famous football stadium closed in September 2018, because the archive that would have made identification possible is gone. The ground is still there. The question is whether anyone will ever have the means to ask it. Number 9. Al Bayt Stadium. The Al Bayt Stadium in Al Khor, 35 miles north of Doha, was built in the shape of a Bedouin tent, a design meant to honor the nomadic heritage of the Qatari people. The name Al Bayt means the house, or the tent, in Arabic, and the structure rises from the desert north of the Qatari capital in a form that its architects intended as a tribute to the tradition of portable shelter that allowed human life to persist in one of the most hostile climates on Earth. Below the tent, beneath the construction footprint that the stadium required and the road network that connected it to the Qatar World Cup infrastructure, the desert held something that predated the Bedouin tradition by several thousand years. The Al Khor area of northern Qatar is one of the most archaeologically dense zones on the Arabian Peninsula, occupied continuously since at least 4000 BC. Used as a trading port through the Bronze Age and the Iron Age and the pre-Islamic period, and containing a concentration of ancient fish trap structures and settlement remains that the Qatar Pras Museums Authority has identified as among the most significant pre-Islamic sites in the Gulf region. Construction of the Al Bayt complex began in 2014. The fish traps have been in the water since before writing was invented. The northern Qatari coast contains a series of ancient fish trap structures known as hadra, low-walled stone enclosures built in tidal zones to trap fish as the tide recedes. The Qatar Museums Authority Coastal Heritage Survey, led by archaeologist Ferhan Sakal and published in the Arabian Archaeology and Epigraphy Journal in 2018, identified 23 confirmed ancient hadra structures along the northern Qatari coast within a 30-kilometer radius of Al Khor. 7 of the 23 were classified as at risk from ongoing coastal development. The survey documented the Al Khor area as a significant node in the pre-Islamic coastal trade network of the Arabian Gulf, with excavated assemblages including ceramics from Mesopotamia, Iran, and South Asia indicating active participation in long-distance exchange networks from the 3rd millennium BC onward. That survey was published in 2018. Construction of the Al Bayt Stadium began in 2014. During construction of the Al Bayt complex and its associated infrastructure, workers in 2015 reported to QMA archaeological monitors the presence of ancient ceramic material and stone structural remnants in a coastal road construction corridor, approximately 2 miles from the stadium site. The QMA Archaeological Monitoring Report for the Al Khor Infrastructure Zone, available through Qatar's Environmental Impact Archive, documents the removal of 4 ceramic assemblages and 1 partial stone structure for museum storage during the 2015 construction season, with construction proceeding on schedule following documentation. The report identifies the ceramic material as consistent with pre-Islamic coastal occupation, dated to between approximately 300 BC and 400 AD. It does not estimate how much additional material was incorporated into construction fill without sufficient time for documentation. Then, in a construction trench for the Al Bayt's perimeter access road, workers found 7 camel skeletons, partially articulated. The QMA Archaeological Monitor described their arrangement in his field notes. Obtained by Doha-based English-language newspaper The Peninsula through a public records request in 2017, as inconsistent with natural deposition. The field notes recommended specialist review. The review, if conducted, was not documented in the Monitor's subsequently filed report, which noted only that animal skeletal material had been recovered and retained for analysis. No published analysis of the camel assemblage has appeared in the archaeological literature. Pre-Islamic Arabian ritual practice involving camel sacrifice is documented in the earliest Arabic literary sources and in Nabatean rock inscriptions across the Arabian Peninsula. The Nabatean civilization controlled the incense trade routes across Arabia from approximately 400 BC to 100 AD and maintained ritual practices at tradeway stations, including votive depositions of animal remains documented archaeologically at sites in Jordan and northern Saudi Arabia. The ceramic assemblages recovered during Al Bayt construction dated to precisely that period. A spatially arranged assemblage of camel remains at a site whose ceramics place it at the center of Nabatean-era Gulf trade is not automatically evidence of ritual deposition, but it is not inconsistent with it. And the Monitor's field notes said exactly that. The Al Bayt Stadium hosted 6 matches of the 2022 World Cup, including the opening match between Qatar and Ecuador, watched by a global television audience of hundreds of millions. The stadium's design celebrates the Bedouin tent tradition. Its marketing emphasized the honor paid to Qatar's nomadic heritage. The older heritage, the pre-Islamic coastal traders whose fish traps are still in the water 2 miles away, whose ceramic trade goods arrived from Mesopotamia when Abraham was alive, whose camel bones may have been arranged in a ritual pattern that no specialist has been formally asked to interpret, was not included in the marketing. The monitoring report noted the camel assemblage and moved on. The field notes said inconsistent with natural deposition. The field notes said potentially indicative of ritual deposition. Could what the construction monitor found in that access road trench be the first physical evidence of a Nabatean-era ritual site on the Qatari coast, at a location whose ceramic evidence places it at the center of the pre-Islamic Gulf trade network? If the specialist review was conducted, but not published, where are those findings? The field notes are in the public record. The analysis they recommended is not. Number 10. Estadio Centenario. The Cadua people of what is now Uruguay were among the last indigenous peoples in South America to resist European conquest. They held the Banda Oriental, the eastern shore of the Rio de la Plata, for 3 centuries of intermittent warfare against Spanish and then Uruguayan forces, never definitively conquered, never absorbed by treaty into a colonial structure they refused to recognize. On April 11, 1831, 17 years after Uruguayan independence, the government of Fructuoso Rivera invited the remaining Charrua leaders to a meeting at a place called Salsapudes, which translates from Spanish as "get out if you can," and had them massacred. Approximately 300 Charrua were killed. The survivors were enslaved. 4 were taken to Paris for exhibition as specimens of a vanishing race. The Charrua were then declared officially extinct. 99 years after Salsapudes, Uruguay built a stadium in the capital's Central Park, Park Battle, and hosted the first FIFA World Cup. The workers who broke ground on the Estadio Centenario in February 1930 had 11 Bach and Matt to build a 90,000-seat stadium on land that had been Charrua ancestral ground, and over which no pre-construction investigation of any kind was conducted. They finished on time. The Estadio Centenario was built between February and July 1930 in Park Battle, a 62-hectare urban park in Montevideo. Uruguayan archaeologist Daniel Lapont of the CONICET National Council of Scientific Research, in a 2008 study published in the Revista del Museo de Antropología of Argentina, placed the Park Battle area within the zone of documented Charrua seasonal occupation based on 19th century ethnographic accounts and the distribution of lithic material recovered from Montevideo's 20th century urban development. Lapont identified 6 instances between 1950 and 2000 in which construction projects in the Park Battle cache area had documented encounters with lithic material and faunal remains consistent with pre-colonial indigenous occupation. None of those encounters had triggered formal archaeological investigation. The 1930 construction of the Estadio Centenario preceded the enactment of any Uruguayan heritage protection legislation. The stadium was built by a workforce operating under a construction schedule so compressed that workers reportedly labored in continuous shifts for the final weeks before the tournament's opening match. Uruguayan labor historian Carlos Zubillaga, in his 1988 study of the 1930 World Cup's social history, published by the Universidad de la República, interviewed descendants of 1930 construction workers. 2 individuals, whose fathers had worked on the original construction, reported family accounts of ceramic fragments and worked stone found during excavation of the stadium's western terrace foundation, removed without documentation. These accounts are oral history from families of deceased workers and are not independently verifiable by any primary record. Their significance lies not in what they prove, but in what the absence of formal documentation makes impossible to disprove. The Charrua, as an officially extinct people, have been the subject of a significant heritage recognition movement in Uruguay since the 1990s, driven in part by the work of the Asociación de Descendientes de la Nación Charrua, ADENCH, whose historical research, published in 2006 as the document Memoria Charrua, explicitly identifies the Estadio Centenario site as constructed on land of ancestral significance without pre-construction heritage consultation. ADENCH submitted formal requests to the Uruguayan Ministry of Education and Culture in 2007 and 2012 requesting a subsurface archaeological investigation of the stadium site. The ministry acknowledged both requests. No investigation has been conducted. Lapont's 2008 study noted that the Banda Oriental's indigenous archaeological record was systematically underrepresented in the scholarly literature, a gap he attributed to the ideological legacy of the 19th century Extinction Declaration, which had removed the Charrua from the category of peoples whose material heritage warranted protection. A people officially declared extinct in 1831 had, in the relevant bureaucratic framework, no living heritage to protect. That framework shaped Uruguay's relationship with its pre-colonial past for the entire 20th century. The Estadio Centenario was built in 1930 inside it. No mechanism existed to ask what lay in the ground before the concrete went in. The first World Cup final was played at the Centenario on July 30, 1930. Uruguay defeated Argentina 4-2. The stadium that hosted the birth of the world's most watched sporting competition was built in 11 months on Sharoa land that had never been archaeologically surveyed, by workers whose descendants describe finding indigenous material in the foundation trenches, above a people officially extinguished from the historical record 99 years earlier. Whatever the Centenario's ground contains, it has never been asked. Beneath every stadium on this list, something ancient waited. Not in the metaphorical sense, but in the literal. Physical sense of material deposited in the ground by human hands that were making meaning, making ritual, making community, on land that was then covered in concrete for the purpose of football. The Aztec priests who sealed their chamber. The Dilmun families who buried their dead near the sea. The Quaisan who left their shells on the Greenpoint coast for 120,000 years. They did not expect the stadiums. They did not expect to be forgotten. But the ground remembers, even when the institutions do not. If you watch this far, subscribe so you never miss what the official record leaves out. Leave a like if this one stayed with you, and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you are watching from.